This is Stories from Palestine podcast. My name is Crystal. I studied history and teaching, and I am a licensed tour guide. I'm married to a Palestinian from Beit Yaffa. We have 2 children, and I have no work now due to the situation. So please, if you enjoy this weekly podcast, click the Ko-fi link in the show notes and make a donation to support the show. And please share the podcast with your friends. It was on the 12th of April, 2021, 3.5 years ago, that I received a message on Instagram from an account that was called Zatar Diva. And I want to read it for you. It says, I loved the second Yaffa episode. It was heartbreaking to hear about the theater because I remember my teta told me she went to one of those theaters to see Gone with the Wind when it came out. She also remembered the bloody limbs and the bodies around the theater during the Nakba as she was fleeing with her family. That image stayed with her forever. I really appreciate the details in your podcast, and I'm grateful I found you. Thanks for all your work. So after that message, we chatted, and I got to know that Zatar Diva is actually Nada Samih-Rotondo. She's a Palestinian-American educator, a writer, and a mother of 3 children. And last year, she published her first book called All Water Has Perfect Memory. And we were supposed to do this podcast interview about a year ago, but then 7 October happened and our podcast interview never happened until now. So here we are a year later, and I'm really honored to speak to the author of this amazing book that I personally really enjoyed reading. So Nada, thank you for being on the show. And can you introduce yourself a bit further and maybe also give us a synopsis of the book without giving everything away?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, this feels like it's been years in the making, so I'm very grateful that we're able to do this today. So yes, my name's Nada. I was born in Kuwait, and I immigrated to the U.S., or I was taken to the U.S. by my mother in 1990, a couple weeks into the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and I was only 6 years old. I ended up in the tiny state of Rhode Island. It's the smallest state here in the Union. We're on the East Coast, about an hour south of Boston and like 4 hours away from New York. The book, bits and pieces of it had come to me over the years, and it really wasn't until the lockdown of the pandemic where I sat down and was finally like, okay, I think I have a book here. And it's a multi-generational Palestinian-American memoir. It's mainly about my maternal line. I go all the way back to my great-grandmother who lived in Palestine during the Ottoman era. And then I follow my teta's experience, which she was the Nakba generation. She was in her early 20s when that happened. And then I have a piece about my mother in like the 60s and 70s in Kuwait. And then I get into my story.
When I read it, I could recognize, because I live here obviously also, so many stories from the relation that is between the family members and the land. But then there is a lot of different themes that you weave into this book. So can you explain the title of the book, All Water Has Perfect Memory?
Sure. So the title came to me as an idea from, one of my favorite authors is Toni Morrison. And she actually has a speech where she talks about how all water has a perfect memory. And she was talking about it in relationship to like the Mississippi River flooding and people thinking that it's flooding when really it's just remembering where it used to flow, right? Because now it's this big built environment around it. So here people are assuming that the water's traveling where it shouldn't be, right? Where it's not allowed to be, when in reality it's remembering. And our bodies are mostly water, right? So there's parts of things that have happened to my life and in my maternal line where we might not have logical memory of it, but we have physical memory, and this memory lives in the waters of our body. So I put those kind of themes together, and that's why I had to use that title.
And there is a lot of reference in your book to water. And what I found so beautiful is that you don't only describe memories and stories from your family, but you really write in a very literary way. Beautiful words. It's more than just a memoir. So, first of all, can you share some of the family history a bit into more like detail and some of the memories that come out from that history from your grandmother, your great grandmother, your mother?
Sure. Well, one of the main things, so there were sort of a handful of stories, and I think most people in the diaspora would agree, right? You have the same sort of five stories that the family just passes on a lot, which I'm grateful for that my grandmother was such a great, like, oral storyteller. Some Palestinian families in the diaspora actually have the opposite experience where there's so much trauma that they can't even reach those memories. So I am grateful that, I come from folks who did want to talk about it. So there's always these detailed images and stories of Yaffa. My teta absolutely loved her hometown of Yaffa. The sea air was something that will never leave her, that smell. And, she was always very effusive and detailed about life on the coast. She was also very detailed in talking about how she used to always stress that they had neighbors. Yes, they were Muslim Arabs, but they lived side by side with Christian Arabs and Jews as well, and how that was just a normal part of everyone's life for generations, that this is a multi-religious, multi-ethnic part of the world that was a major center of trade for many generations, and it was just a pluralistic society. The class differences, of course, right? And there were instances like the story I talk about my grandparents, they met and married post Nakba in Kuwait, but how if it was pre-Nakba, how this marriage might have never happened because my grandfather was like a farmer, right? A falahi from Tulkarem. And here's my teta, this well-to-do, educated in college woman who was like studying to be a teacher in Yaffa, who, comes from this sort of like aristocratic city girl thing. So we obviously talk about those differences, but just the fact that, her memory of the way of life and how it was, pre-Nakba was really important for me to highlight. And then there was the story that I was always told, which is like sort of a little bit of the center of the memoirs, the thread I try to weave through, that my great grandmother, her experience as a very young person getting married off at like age 13, it seeming like, this was sort of the cultural practice of the time. She was illiterate, but her family was like, moderate, middle income. It was like very common practice to not send the girls to school because it just wasn't deemed necessary. But that is why the time she had my grandmother, who was the first girl, she stressed the importance of education and made sure she, got the best of everything when it came to her education. But that story of her, that it was sort of this mysterious story spoken in whispers, right? That she like lost her first child at a very young age, and that it was this mysterious thing, but that she was taken care of by nuns and like a missionary, but she had to stay away from outside of her community, outside of her family for up to a year. So that was something that always followed me, like, oh, like this is an extraordinary thing for a young person to have to experience. So that's when I started to dig in deeper to her story. So that opened the door for me in a lot of ways, because it's like, yes, some things are memories, some things are things that I know happened, I have pictures of, and there's other things that's like a felt memory, that's a felt history. And I had to sort of not even necessarily fictionalize it, but is this sort of like opening up my intuition and my heart to sort of like listen in that way.
Can you remember what she told you about the Nakba itself when in 1948 they were displaced from Jaffa?
Yeah, so her Nakba story. So apparently it was a period of time for a few weeks where there were sort of like rumors like, these militias are spreading. And it wasn't really until Dar Yassin, the massacre of Dar Yassin, when news of that broke, that's when people really started to panic, I think, more. And there were some sort of like strongholds. They were like, no matter what, we're not leaving. But my grandfather made the call. Her father made the call. His wife had literally, my grandmother's like one of, I think, 10 or 11 children, and the youngest is like 20 years younger. And my great grandmother had literally just given birth 2 weeks before they left. So I don't think it was a decision they came to obviously easily, but I think they were like, we have to make the call for this. They had the resources to go north to Damascus, and they were able to find shelter and get independence there. But by the time they were journeying out with thousands of others. There was chaos because at that point, between those couple of weeks, I think between Dar Yassin and Yaffa, they were dropping leaflets and flyers, which I just think is so haunting because they literally still do the same thing.
Yeah.
And there is that scene that stuck out to my grandmother at that young age of having the sky rain down flyers.
Telling them that they have to leave to find safe place.
Yep. Literally, I think it was like, if you don't leave by such and such date, the same thing will happen to you that just happened to Dar Yassin.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then they went to Damascus, and from there they went on to Kuwait.
Just my grandmother and a sister. They saw the ad for to be a teacher. Hey, we're looking for teachers. So my grandmother and her sister went, but the rest of the family sort of stayed. And I think as the kids got older, they spread out from there. Because she does have brothers who ended up being doctors in Germany and having like intermixed families there. They're still like, I have cousins I've never met that like just speak German. We all spread out. We're all over the place. I have family that ended up going to Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. So, yeah.
Palestinians in the diaspora, they all carry that trauma with them because it's generational. And I think that's also one of the themes that I read in your book, that you also connect to that water and the memory that even you didn't live it somehow through the stories, but also maybe even through DNA.
Absolutely.
Comes. Yeah. Can you explain that, how that affected your life?
So my childhood was made more complicated by the fact that, I had my mom and dad were divorced when I was 2. And so but I was going back and forth to their houses. When the war happened, my mom essentially kidnapped me out. I was 6 and I didn't understand that I was never going to go back. I thought, I'm just going to be back. Like, I'm going to have this fun summer vacation or something in America because I had an uncle here. And okay, I'll learn some English, then go back. Like, I really didn't have a concept that this was forever. So I think my mother, and it was really difficult growing up because she absolutely had trauma that she like could not name, could not deal with, but it played out and of course people who read the book will see there was all kinds of different abuse that it played out in. And I grew up around a lot of like domestic violence, and a lot of it comes from this, I think, this trauma, because this trauma also encourages silence. And I really think that was connected to the Nakba because they're just, I think, different people deal with their trauma differently, of course. But I think that is the pattern that I found in my family, that, we happen to deal with this with silence. And look at how it comes out in all these other ways instead. Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel that in your book also, one of the maybe remedies for this trauma is the storytelling itself, right? So there is these themes, water, trauma, healing, and storytelling is very much part of that.
Yeah, and I was very inspired. I had read all these different retellings, different versions of 1001 Nights and the whole Shahrazad thing. And absolutely, that was the theme, right? It's storytelling to save your life. And as a writer, that definitely spoke to me on so many levels. And I'm like, oh my God, it speaks to me in my life too, because how we tell the story and how we reframe the story, now we have this opportunity to heal and how we reframe the story and take control and power back, right?
You have 3 children. What are their ages?
15, 9, and almost 7. His birthday's next week.
So the older ones, are they aware of your book, the content?
Oh yeah, they are.
And do you feel, how do what do they think about this story?
Yeah, they're really aware. Obviously, my oldest one more aware than the others. As I was writing it, he was such an inspiration in ways that I didn't expect him to be, because he would just come up to me as I was like busy in my room, like typing around, and he's like, oh, cool. Yeah, keep going. It's just kind of like encouraging me. And it's like, oh, you're working on your book? Are you working on your book? But yeah, in terms of the content, they're definitely aware. We're a big family here of just like oversharing millennials that are like all about mental health. It's like, we're going to just like say it loud and proud. And all right, who needs the support and how can we get people the support? And I'm very much an advocate of that. So that is sort of the household that I'm hoping that, I think I have a pretty strong foundation about, 15 years of this. But I tell them all the time, I'm like intentionally doing this or saying this or acting like this because I am trying to break cycles, or I intentionally need to walk away and take some time for myself right now, or whatever I need to do to like reground myself because I'm having a trauma response and I'm going to go take care of myself and then I can come back. It's just like a very intentional way of parenting because I do not want to repeat the same cycles with my children.
I want to read a quote from the book. It says, "Of the many stories my teta would tell me over the years, there is one she never dares speak of. As the years turn into decades, untold stories settle deep in the body, like debris on the sea floor. But sometimes storms churn up the bottom of the ocean, and what was left buried floats up to the surface for all to see." And here you so beautifully talk about the trauma, about water, but also, as you say, you want to break this silence and to talk about it because this is the only way to heal.
Yep, we can't heal it if we can't see it, right? We have to be able to pull it out and see it.
I think even your name relates to water, right?
Nada means hope, from what I was told. Yeah, and there is the chapter where I talk about my like first 6 years childhood in Kuwait. I tie that in with the writing as well. I bring in a folk tale about the origins of pearl diving. I connect it to Kuwait and how these like there is that sort of story that pearls are a result. The oyster's way of protecting itself, right, is to take this foreign thing and then it turns it into this beautiful thing. So I think that is like hope of sort of transforming or alchemizing something that is negative into something different.
I think I read that Neda also means dewdrop.
Oh, that's right. Yes. The rain. Yeah. After the rain. Absolutely. That's right. Yes. Literally means dewdrops. Yeah.
Here in Palestine, you see every morning, even in the hot summers in the mountains. I take my kids to school in the top of Beit Jala, which is 900 meters above sea level. And every morning when we go, even in the summer, we can see a bit of fog.
I love that.
And there is dewdrops everywhere. And this means that you can grow things even in the summer and you don't need to water it a lot because it cools down so much in the mountains overnight that you have this like natural way of watering. And that's very hopeful also.
It is very hopeful, especially in a region that would otherwise be dry. Yeah, that's beautiful.
I want to ask you also about, I think this is a topic that I've never discussed on the podcast, that many Palestinians that fled in 1948 ended up in Kuwait. So can you tell us a little bit about the Palestinians in the diaspora in Kuwait? What was life like and what happened?
Yeah. So, when I was born and for those first 6 years, folks were, from my understanding, pretty educated, like middle working class. My mother like worked at a bank. She was administrative assistant in a bank. My father was an accountant, just regular, regular stuff. People would go on vacations. My mother grew up every summer that just throw all 5 kids in the car, like stack them in there and just go to Beirut for a month or go to Iraq for a month. And they would either had like aunties, cousins, or they would just make new friends. They would like rent a flat and just be there for a couple months in the summer. My grandmother would have these experiences of, like the markets being like, oh, we were so happy and excited to be able to pick like fresh berries and fruit in Lebanon because it was so drastically different and hot in Kuwait. You can't just go out and pick fresh fruit, right? So it's those kind of experiences. So my mother and her siblings really grew up with a much different experience, just having the resources and the time. And it was them and their neighbors, and they lived in these apartment buildings, much like folks in the Arab world still do now. But everyone in that building, they knew since birth. So it's like my mom, even the house that I was in up until I was 6, this is the house she was born and raised in. And they still lived across from the same aunties, cousins, friends, neighbors who are Egyptian, Iraqi, Lebanese, Syrian, just from all over, all in the same building. And they all grew up together and they would intermarry or go to school together and help each other find jobs. And it was Yes, but so here's the interesting thing, and it took some research to get the actual language of the laws because I knew anecdotally that there was a sense of impending doom as my mom and her siblings came of age, as they attended college, as they were making these life decisions of, okay, where do I go? What do I do? What do I study? What's my career? I never understood like why were they so stressed at that point in their life, but that is because the way it is in Kuwait, even though they're born there, they do not have citizenship. It is not like it is actually one of the hardest places in the world to get citizenship. It's not just a simple matter of you were born there or a resident or you even married a Kuwaiti. Like I think you have to be married for a certain number of years even before you can get Kuwait citizenship. So, and I never understood, like, well, why would that be so bad to not have citizenship? But it literally blocks people from studying in certain fields or being hired in certain places. And if you were hired, even you're doing the same job, you're getting paid less if your nationality is not a Kuwaiti nationality. So all of these sort of embedded legal restraints, which is really racism, right? I mean, the US has it too. They were just all embedded in the laws. So that is why my uncle, it's why we ended up here, because he had to make a tough call. He said, yeah, I could, study and have to pay out of pocket because I don't have access to tuition like support. And then it would depend on whether or not a company would hire me. And even if a company hired me, right, like if they let me go, I lose residency, which means like you would be there illegally, which
Yeah.
is so absurd. Like I thought the US was absurd when it comes to its legal things. But yeah, it was very tough. So he made the call to come to the US. He was able to get some sort of scholarship, studied here and was an engineer for a while until he became a math teacher. But just that's a really tough call because you're leaving your ancestors, you're leaving your traditions, your culture, your language. And it's, yeah. So him and all his siblings had to make that call. My mom had to make that call. Yeah, so in some ways, I've spoken to, so like my dad's side, after I reconnected with them, I spoke to them a lot. And there is this sort of, they look back at that time like, oh, the Palestinians that were in Kuwait, man, they were living a good life, and it's like comparatively, right? I guess to a certain degree, that was certainly true. But there was always this overhanging sort of like the elephant in the room was, if your company decided to lay you off, if anything was like that was to happen, like you were just dispensable, like you would lose your right to be in the country.
Yeah.
So it was a very fragile situation.
And then Palestinians were displaced for the second time because the invasion.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say like how it must have felt like for my grandmother who, here she is growing up in a place, this is her homeland, having to be uprooted that first time. She worked her entire life in Kuwait, first as a teacher, then a principal, became superintendent of schools.
Wow.
Like retired, was collecting her little retirement, and then had to be uprooted again to a country that, she doesn't even speak the language, obviously will not collect retirement, is no longer comfortable. And it's as though you have to all start from scratch. So it was really, really complicated. From what I understand, it was thousands and thousands of Palestinians left. And when things started to calm down, some wanted to try to go back and some did, but it was like such a small percentage because at that point the situation was very precarious. Some companies just were like, nope, we're not hiring you for Palestinian. We don't want anything to do with you. It was very racist. And other people were able to sort of stay and make it work. But I mean, the population of Palestinians went down quite a bit. And the majority, I believe, ended up in Jordan.
And so your mother decided to leave. Well, nobody expected her to do such a thing, right? From what I read in the book, is that even your dad was like, oh, she would never do that. And she was still very young. And she just took the car and drove and got all the paperwork done and went to a country that, it was all new for all of you. Do you have any memory of that?
Oh, yes. I remember the vivid details because, as a child, I really liked school, and school was about to start, and it was the end of, it was like almost the end of our summer. And I go to turn on my summer cartoons and the TV's not working. So it's all these little memories like that of like, why isn't the TV not working? And I did try to describe that scene because that was the moment. There's all these moments in my life where there's a clear before and after. This is the moment where like nothing will ever be the same after this. And that was one of those moments of many.
Wow.
And I'm sure more to come in our life.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's I I had one of my other uncle was staying with us. He came upstairs. He was in the parking lot smoking a cigarette, and he saw the Iraqi tanks go down the street. And here my mom is trying to get ready for work. And he said, I don't think you're going to work today.
Wow.
And my other uncle literally called, which back in 1990 was not an easy phone call, right? It's a collect phone call and it takes forever to connect. And, you know, there's like static on the line and you're on the landline. And he was like, I'm seeing it on CNN right now, Samuel, you're not going to work. And then we started to hear the bombs shortly after. We only lived like 20 minutes from downtown. So that was very scary. And I mean, as a child, looking back as a mom, I'm like, that must have been so scary for her. But in the moment, she stayed very calm. So I stayed calm and I was very much up for adventure. So and I'm sure your kids are the same. It's like, oh, time to go in the cupboard or whatever it was. It was like time to hide under the couch and take out the flashlight, you know? And I did not understand the gravity of the situation as a 6-year-old.
No, that's exactly what happens now when we have the air raid alarm and the kids are like, oh, we're going to the cupboard. And actually now we found out, my father-in-law told us that the whole room of the kids, not just the cupboard, the whole room is the reinforced room. So we now know we have more space.
Good to know.
And the first thing that Hadi does is like he grabs all his electronics, like his iPad and his VR glasses and his phone. And he's like, I'm taking this with me. However long it takes, I have something to do. And yeah, it's true. If the mother stays calm, then the children will also remain calm. So you don't really feel as a child the danger maybe. But yeah, then you came to a whole new country. They spoke a whole new language. You thought this is just temporarily. We're doing a holiday. Do you remember the moment when you realized that we're not going to go away? This is my future.
Yeah, I write about this. It was like about a year or so into it. I had completed the first grade in America, learned enough English, but we moved. We were staying with like a family friend's house, and then we moved to my uncle's house. So I moved schools, and I think had started that school year, but the kids there were not as nice as the other kids in the other school. And because I had learned enough English to get by, they didn't really think that I was different, but I was different enough, like socially and culturally. They're just like, what is going on with this girl? And I think I had just hit my limit, because I do remember that moment. I frantically came home and I was picking up the phone and just dialing numbers. And my mom was like, who are you calling? What are you dialing? And I was just like, I need to call my Baba. It's time for me to talk to Baba. Like I had it with America. I was like ready. And they're all just looking around. I remember that moment because all the adults, you could tell like my aunt and uncle sort of were like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
And I was like, what do you mean, uh-oh? And I really did. I had like some sort of emotional breakdown. I just remember being surrounded by my mom, my aunt and uncle, and just like heaving, like having a hard time breathing. Like I had a physical response to, what do you mean we're not going back? Yeah.
Did you ever talk to your dad after you left? No.
No, I had no idea.
Wow.
Nope, I didn't. He was trying. So again, when we reconnected 30 years later, he had been trying those 30 years, all these different ways to contact me. He had like tracked down my grandmother's siblings. He had tracked down just like literally anybody, our old neighbors from Kuwait. He was trying to get any information that he could, and he couldn't. So I was, the narrative that was created around me and my father was that, oh, he's not really looking for you anyway. Just, yeah. And I literally had not heard his voice for like those 31 years. Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, for your mom, it was all too traumatic and she was like, better to break it off completely.
Yeah.
And for you, you never knew anything, also the story of what was his side of the story. So now you reconnected.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm curious because that's not written in the book. Can you give us a little update on?
It is a little bit. It is a little bit towards the end, and yes, it. So that happened. So in 2019, it was September of 2019. And I had this random like Facebook message, and I don't really use Facebook. So I was like, what is this? And as soon as I saw the name, I was like, wait, are we cousins or something? And she's like, Nada, I'm your half sister. And I was like, oh,
wow.
God, okay. Okay. But yeah, it was truly a shock of my life. And again, I had like a lot of physical reactions. I literally had some sort of amnesia that came across, which is one of the sections I write about, where I went to go pick up my kids from the daycare, and they have a code for parents to put in to like unlock the door. And like I've been using this code for over a year. My brain could not remember the code. It was gone.
Wow. Yeah.
Had to call my husband. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. So just to try to like function and have a day-to-day life, that whole week I was like not functional. In that first moment when I spoke with him, it was so strange because I was a very much like an out-of-body experience, because I was also raised in an environment, unfortunately, right? I'm in a place in America, and this is sort of what makes my experience different from most Arab American. Well, maybe not most, but I did not grow up around an Arab American community. Most people, when they come here, they find their little, right, whether it's Dearborn or Detroit or Brooklyn or, you know, there are these little enclaves, right, of immigrant groups. Nope, not here. I'm with I grew up in an Italian-American town. Everyone's Catholic. It was like me and like a handful of other kids who were not. That was about it. So it was a very just like strange experience. So, but I grew up in this environment, and I knew logically, right, that like, Arab men are not XYZ, right? That I shouldn't have these stereotypes. But because I never really interacted with them other than the stories I was fed, I had this whole different impression. And here he is talking to me, and he's just like a normal sounding, not scary, right, person. And I was like, oh my God, I've really been messed up by this situation. I'm having this reaction.
And then you met each other. Did you meet more than once or only once?
So at this point, it's been a couple times, because I went in 2021 to Amman, and we just went actually a month ago. He wasn't able to leave work. He works in Saudi Arabia, but I was able to hang out with my siblings. So I have 3 half siblings, a lovely stepmom, and my grandmother is still around. So my dad's mom. And yeah, my grandfather, this is the interesting story, because I have very fond memories of my grandfather, because my grandmother and grandfather were essentially my like full-time caretakers. My mom was actually the weekend parent, and I didn't know that until I reconnected, and I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so my grandfather had literally looked for me until the day he passed, which was up until I want to say it was like fall or winter of 2012. And yeah, he was someone I never stopped thinking about. And then to come to learn that like he had literally taught all the kids, like, look for Nada, don't stop looking for Nada. Like, yeah, it's really, I had to really reframe and rework everything in my brain, because, you know, you become identified with certain, like I became my identity it was such a steeped identity of being fatherless or being unwanted or, you know, like, and it was easy for me to take that story on, because I mean, everyone I grew up with, we're all like working class folks. Nobody really had a father growing up. So it was just like, oh, okay, you're also fatherless. All right. It really does do a lot for your sort of like way you value yourself or the way you view yourself, to suddenly be like, oh, these people were actually, my family was actually looking for me all this time.
Wow.
They actually never stopped looking for me. Yeah, it's been a wild ride.
That must be so important for a healing process. Even though it comes late, at least now you know that they were looking for you. Listen, in your book, you write mostly the maternal side of the family. It's like the line through the moms and the grandmothers. So now that you reconnected with your dad's side, is that also a story that we can expect? Are you going to write about it?
Yeah. Yep. I've been working on it. Hopefully it'll be completed within the next year, but it's very similar, where it's going to be like all these different sort of style of essays, where some are flashbacks of like my childhood and young adulthood. And some are actually, I'm going to delve deeper into my father's side, because there's scenes, because there's, so immediately upon my mom taking me out, he didn't know, of course, that was like the last thing that he assumed that she would do. He had stayed behind. So all these events sort of happen as he stayed behind. And as the Iraqi forces sort of like got deeper in, and sort of the war started to take over more of people's lives. So he's got that perspective of what it was like for Palestinians when they stayed. And my grandfather actually suffered a pretty serious heart attack. He did survive it, but it was the combination, I think, of the bombing and my kidnapping that just did him in. So they had to sort of stop looking for me for that moment and try to find him a working hospital. Everything was sort of like shut down because of the bombing.
Wow.
So that was everybody's immediate concern. So I am going to talk about his side. And then all these like really interesting historical things I'm finding. So my father's father, actually my father's grandfather. He met him as an infant, so he doesn't have memory of meeting him, but he had gotten a gift from him. But he was actually one of the like they were there. They were the mayors of Yaffa, like the family, just the Jabir family was this like well-to-do family in Yaffa. Their house is still there, but it's got turned into a school.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I can send you some information. Like my dad always finds things and sends it to me for my research, but it was very interesting. So I have ancestors. It was my great grandfather who actually, they were the ones who commissioned the building of the like second or third biggest mosque in Palestine, I believe. And it's the biggest one in Yaffa, and it's like on the water, and it's still there. Miraculously was not destroyed, and it's still there, and people can visit. One day, inshallah, as all Palestinians say, we'll go back and see. But yeah, that was a wild ride, because in most of the men in the family were either like imams or mayors, these like well-to-do people. And I like just would have had no idea that was where I came from. Yeah.
In your book, I can read that besides the story of your family and besides the different themes that we mentioned, you also use a lot of interesting information, both historical information, so you can really learn something about the history of Palestine, also the landscape, how it was formed and shaped, but also things about biology or just interesting things to know. So for me, that was what made it so I couldn't stop reading because I'm sucked into this story. I felt like I'm getting into your body. I feel like I know you so much better now and all the things that you've gone through. And I think it's like a miracle that with so much generational trauma, so many things that you went through as a person, as a child, and the woman that you became.
Thank you so much.
That is just such an amazing development. And I think that this is my opinion about everything. You don't choose the things that happen to you.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's fate or if it's supposed to happen. It happens, but then you are the one who has to choose what you do with that situation.
Yes. How to react to it. Yes.
And you chose to use it, to make it your strength. And especially by writing such a book, I think you didn't only help yourself in healing this ancestral trauma. I think you can help a lot of other Palestinians in the diaspora who have similar stories. So for this, I think it's a pearl. It's a very, very important book that I really strongly advise everybody to read.
Thank you so much.
But you studied the Masters of Fine Arts, a degree in writing fiction.
Mm-hmm.
This is, even though sometimes it could read as fiction, I mean, it has this intensity that you cannot almost imagine that these things can really happen to somebody. But it's nonfiction. Why did you choose to write a memoir instead of a fiction as a first book?
Yeah, so I had tried to write. So I actually had a short story out. One of my first things that ever got published was this little short story about, it was like a fictionalized version of my teta's Nakba experience. And I was like, okay, I can only really get at my story through fiction. And I had convinced myself that it would be too hard to do nonfiction. I really had to face it head on and just let it be hard. And in the meantime, I think it forced me to be creative, because I'm also a picky reader. Like I love reading and I read everything, but if I'm bored, I'm going to walk away, and try something else. And I wanted to not be bored. And I know my life story. It's boring to me, but I wanted to tell it in a way that did involve some of those elements of fiction, right? So there's some things that are speculative. There's some things that, I'm setting scenes in the same way that you would with fiction. I have characters in the same way, but I'm also involving these like stream of consciousness, lyrical essay sort of vibe, because that is how trauma works. That's what trauma does to your brain. It's not linear. So I felt like I'd have more freedom to do those things with nonfiction than fiction. And it was one of those things, again, it was like, oh, I have to face this and I have to face it head on. There are people, and there's nothing wrong with this, but I've heard interviews with authors all the time that are saying like, oh, this story, it's fiction, but it's based on XYZ because I'm just not ready to tackle or whatever. I had to approach it this way. And I just was like, no, I want and I think I felt the sense of urgency because of the pandemic, but also my teta passed away in April of the pandemic. And she was living in Georgia with my mom. So she's out of state. We were in deep lockdown. We were in the her soul decided to leave to the other side in a way that she's like, nope, I don't want to trouble anybody.
Nobody can come.
And I was like so upset and needing that human need to grieve and to mourn. So the book really grew out of that. I pulled out all these old pictures. I went into the closets and the shoe boxes and just pulled out all these things. And I just was like reflecting and writing, and it grew and it grew. And I was like, oh, okay, this is my grieving process turned into this thing. And I just like, it was almost like an offering for her. Yeah.
Wow. It's too bad that she never able to read it.
I'm sure she is on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah. She looked over your shoulder every word you wrote.
Yeah, I felt her presence. And she was a writer as well. And that's a piece also that she was in this environment where she didn't feel like she was ever able to publish any of her things because she's like, as a woman, as a mom, all these things. And she just kind of blocked herself from pursuing it. So I feel, but she always encouraged, she's like, don't stop writing. When she was alive, she's like, just keep writing. And I'm like, okay, I hear you, Teta, let's go.
Did your family members read it and give you any feedback, any response? How did they take it? I mean, it's quite personal about certain things of your life.
Okay, well, I knew it was going to open a Pandora's box. So just like full transparency, it was not, okay, it was not necessarily easy. I knew, and a part of me knew, but it was like worth it for me because I had nothing to lose. I grew up as someone who always had to take care of myself. I wasn't going to lose anything. You know, so there are so many people when they're in domestic violence or just family situations in general, what kind of filters them is the fact like, oh, well, I depend on my family. They take care of me. They house me. They feed me. They whatever me. I hadn't had that, right? So I didn't feel that obligation, and I felt the obligation had to be for healing to move forward. And I wanted to do it also in a way where I had the writing process is also it's a community process. I didn't do this on my own. For one thing, I was in therapy the whole time, but also, I have had my editors, I had my like publishing house, like there were so many other eyes on it. And there were a few times I had to go back into the draft and say, all right, are you being balanced here? Are you being fair here? And it asked me to go back and expand it. And it was a challenging, but very healing and necessary thing that had to happen. So it's like, I didn't want to just show the abuse. I wanted to also show, there are beautiful things I inherited. There are beautiful, things that are getting passed on to me, not just the trauma, right? So I had to be fair and balanced, and I feel comfortable and confident that I did. So with that being said, the folks in so I'm the oldest cousin, and the folks in my generation that are at least 10 or 8 years younger than me, they had a pretty positive reaction. They're like, good for you, break that cycle. Thank you for speaking out, right? Millennials and Gen Z folks are all on board with that. The older, the boomers on up, not so much. It did cause it did cause some headaches. But again, it's like, look, I had speak my truth. You can go ahead and write your book and speak your truth, right? So yeah, it was not necessarily easy, but I knew what I was getting into, but I had to do it anyway.
Did your father read the book?
I think so, but also English is not his first language. So I don't know how much of it, right? Like he might have read it. I don't know how much is like really absorbed. I would love to have it translated into Arabic. I think that would be super powerful. And and then maybe he'd absorb more of it. Because I think he knew that things were hard for me in the US. I don't think he really understands the details or the depth of how hard it was for me here.
Yeah, I would love for him to read it because I think basically he would catch up with so much that happened to you in your life. Yeah, I could not have asked this question if we did the interview a year ago, because by that time you had just published it, but now it's a year later. How is it like? Are you selling many books? Are you getting response from people, reviews? So after a year into this project, how is it going?
So there definitely been a lot of positive responses. There are a few reviews like between Goodreads and Amazon. I've had a really supportive team of folks that have helped to spread the word out. So I've had interviews done with different like literary magazines. I've done all kinds of talks locally, different universities and things. I've traveled and done like book talks, and I can continue to. I think the most powerful thing, it wasn't so much the outward, it was the inward, is that I thought I was on this road or on this process sort of as the very like individual. I mean, I try to think collectively, and I very much do in other parts of my life. But when it came to my writing life, I think I was very individualistic in my thinking. And I think a week later, literally was October 7th, and I was like, oh my God, I'm part of something so much bigger than me. And then I actually was able to see the potential, because especially for like Western audiences, right? Like, because I speak English and because I been here most of my life, I was like, wow, okay, I am being like, the spirit is working with me right now. They are amplifying, right? And that is to be part of something bigger than that is really like the highest honor, to have my story, my voice, my experience being used to sort of heal the trauma and like just bring the story out to every corner of the world, because there's so many of, not just Palestinian, but other folks who've like gone through this, but it's like Palestine connects that all. And I think that is what this genocide has been bringing up a lot for Western audiences. I think the Arab world already knew this, but like it is connected to everything. It's like it is an environmental issue, it is a economic issue, it is an education issue, a health issue. It is literally connected to every facet of life. It's like intimately connected with, right, the US continuing to use our tax dollars to go, murder innocents, and that all has a karmic price. And if my book can help sort of bring that into focus and reframe it for folks who just don't understand what's happening, I think, that's a huge honor.
Where can people get the book if they want to read it after hearing this interview?
Yeah, so definitely Barnes and Noble, Amazon. You can also ask your local booksellers to carry it. So the publisher is Jaded Ibis Press, and they use Ingram, which is a program, a company that helps booksellers connect to book buyers. So if you are someone who like runs a bookstore and you're looking to get your hands on it, you just can contact Ingram. And yeah.
Do you have any idea if it's available in the educational bookstore in Jerusalem?
I don't know that, but off the top of my head.
Because if not, then I have a connection.
Then yeah,
I can make sure that they get it.
I don't know how it works internationally, but I was told by Jaded Ibis Press that yes, that's definitely possible, is to get it. And I would love to get it into more international bookstores, especially in the Arab world right now.
But is it available as ebook that people can download it on their Kindle?
I think yes, it is. Yes, I want to say it is available now as an ebook. Mm-hmm.
That would be great, because in that way, people all over the world can read it.
Yes. I totally forgot about the ebook option. I'm such a old-fashioned, like I need the paper in my hand
you
person.
Need the paper.
But yes, the ebook is definitely available.
Yes, what I will do is I will add some information in the show notes of the podcast so that people can click and find it easily. And I just recommend everybody to read it and to give it as a present. And to share this, because it's just so beautiful to read. And I want to really thank you for your time. Is there anything you want to add as a last thing before we wrap up the interview?
I mean, besides what I always say when I wrap up interviews is Palestine will be free.
Yay.
That is just, I don't think there's nothing truer in my heart every day that like Palestine will be free. Keep staying the course. But yeah, I think for anyone, your story and your experiences matter. So even if it's like just telling your family members, just telling your children, just telling your neighbor, just keep sharing your story. We live in this really immensely polarizing time where our media doesn't necessarily reflect reality, right? And so we have to be really discerning and really cautious and careful of where we're absorbing information. And I want people to share their personal truth is really important, and to listen to their bodies, right? Like that was a huge healing thing for me, is to learn to, all right, this is supposedly a truth, but my body's telling me it's not. So you have to listen to your body too. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. I think that's a great advice to end with. Thank you so much for your time.
You're
It was
so
really
welcome.
wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to be here.
Thank you for listening. I hope you will tune in again next week. And don't forget the opportunity to support the podcast through the Ko-fi link in the show notes.